So thank you so much, Kirsten. I must say that it's been a real honor to be working with Kirsten and Climate-KIC in recent months, where we've managed to get Kirsten involved in some work we're doing around mission-oriented industrial strategy. And she's not only the kind of wisest and one of the most inspirational people I've met recently, and also with incredible concrete background in the investment community, but also the most elegant. So today I purposefully wore my best shoes, forgetting that the way to get into this castle had all these nice little cobbles, and I at one point got stuck between two stones. So it's very good I am here, because it looked dangerous about 10 minutes ago, or 20 minutes ago. Anyway, so what I'd like to do is to really break down this inspirational word, mission finance, because it shouldn't be a word that makes us feel comfortable. If anyone feels comfortable with that word, you're hopefully going to start feeling less comfortable with it by the end of these 3 days, because it actually means changing lots of things. It means changing how we think about the road mapping, if we even have that word in our heads, but especially the way that public, private, and increasingly kind of civil society / philanthropic organizations work together. And it means being much bolder for all three of those groups. And literally the form of the collaborations, what I would almost call the contracts, because currently we have, I think, a problematic type of partnership. And if you speak to any biologist, they will question, as soon as you use the word ecosystem, for example, they'll ask, well, what kind? Is it predator-prey? Is it symbiotic? Is it mutualistic? Is it parasitic? So how do we really build interesting, dynamic, mission-oriented, mutualistic, symbiotic partnerships to tackle climate change, and in the process, direct economic growth? Notice that I don't have here green growth, just economic growth. How do we actually then apply a mission-oriented approach which really tackles the biggest challenges of our time, of which obviously climate change is number one, in terms of how we think about the economy? And this really, I think, means also bringing the topic of innovation outside of just these ministries that are fed every now and then a bone by the Treasury, bringing the challenge of innovation and sustainable growth and innovation used to tackle that at the level of the ministries of finance and treasuries around the world. Or in Europe, it would be DG ECFIN, not just DG RTD. Anyway, so there is also this fact, I think, that since the financial crisis, this whole topic of how do we really use innovation to tackle the most pressing challenges of our time has come to the forefront, because we shouldn't forget there was plenty of growth before the crisis. It was just the wrong kind of growth. And there's actually been plenty of growth that got us into this climate mess. So how do we really talk about not just the rate of growth, which many countries are still tackling with, but really transform that into a discussion about the direction? And this is a friendly time, in theory, to be talking about it, because there has been, whether we talk about the European kind of horizon approach, which for years has been talking about smart, sustainable, and innovation-led growth, or the fact that we have these SDGs, 17 of them, that all these countries have signed up to, and also this comeback of industrial strategy to rethink what kind of activities do we want our different sectors to be collaborating on. This is the time in which, at least in theory, this conversation is, if you want, well-nested, welcomed. And what I want to argue, however, is that, and this is the uncomfortable side, that we literally don't have the tools. We might every now and then in some side conversations over dinner sound really bold and inspirational, but the toolkit that we have, both the policymaking toolkit, but then because it's all about partnerships, the partnering toolkit is incredibly static and problematic. I mean, just look at these words. What is the role of a policymaker? It's always to fix things when they go wrong, of which, climate change is one of the biggest messes around. But if we just think about fixing it, if we think about just fixing the financial crisis, fixing the innovation problem, the public good, basic research, do we actually get big revolutions and the kind of transformational shift that this conference is talking about? And so, de-risking, what does that mean? Who's de-risking who? The risk takers are on one side and the de-riskers are on the other. Enabling, I even use that word sometimes, an enabling environment. But what are you enabling? Facilitating is the worst word of all, I think, because it makes it sound like you're trying to make something easier, right? So facile in Italian and in Latin means easier, when actually, again, the themes that you'll be talking about over the next 3 days are how do we really take on, in a serious partnership, co-investment kind of way, the big difficulties that lie ahead if we want to get that 1.5 degree. incentivizing, facilitating, fixing market and system failures, and even central banks, which in some ways, due to all this QE they plowed into the economies worldwide, at least in the short term, save the system, even they are just seen as lenders of last resort, as opposed to thinking of, the public financial system, which would include public investment banks and central banks together as investors of first resort, actually coming in and providing the kind of finance that's needed to not just save the system, but hopefully also to lead the way in terms of also creating the kind of opportunities which risk-averse private sector perhaps is not too interested in doing, at least initially. And so one of the problems with these really boring, lame words is it just constantly depicts this position of, all the interesting stuff happening in business and particular types of businesses, and then the role of the policymaker is, at best, again, moving around some papers, setting the rules of the game, these horizontal conditions, facilitating, enabling, and then get the hell out of the way, right? And the problem is that positioning, this kind of cartoon image of what you require from the public and private sector simply would historically at least be impossible to explain some of the biggest shifts that we've had over the last course of the 200 years that have sort of defined capitalism. We shouldn't forget that what happened before capitalism was feudalism, which was 500 years of inertia, no change. So it's a real problem if we don't then know how to both describe that, but then also use the lessons that got us these big shifts. Just think of mass production, the major change that it caused to production, distribution, and consumption. If we can't understand how that came about, how the internet came about, and hopefully how green growth and the green revolution will come about, then it's going to be very hard to have a serious kind of mission finance platform and road mapping. And so in the same way that this fixing narrative and framework theory that then trickles down to practitioners on the ground can't help explain the GPTs, general purpose technologies, it also ain't going to be too useful to get us something even more ambitious in the social areas, which the SDGs are much even harder to go into because they combine big changes in regulation and politics and technology, organizational structures. And so what I tried to do, and sorry, this is a self-promotional bit, in my two books that sort of talk to each other was really to argue for a different framework. And what I want to try to do in the next 12 minutes and 42 seconds is sort of give you some insights from this work. And so in the first book, which interestingly was translated in Germany as Das Kapital, the stat, it's kind of cool when your book is translated as Das Kapital, you think, it might create some big change, revolution that's needed. It was really kind of arguing what would an investor of first resort, a portfolio approach, a risk-taking approach, an entrepreneurial approach look like in the policy domain. Every time I say policy or state, always think that I'm talking, of course, about partnerships, but there really is this under-theorized public bit because of this fixing kind of narrative. And I kind of looked again at the history of innovations and really kind of outlined, well, what are the big lessons to be learned from that for the future? And in the value book, it was actually going almost to ground zero. How do we, what are the problems? Sandrine mentioned the problems with GDP. What are the problems actually that then we confront on the ground, literally in terms of the instruments, the kind of taxation and tax incentives and investment instruments that we use when we actually have a problematic understanding of value and also of wealth creation. So it was sort of to also tackle this problem at the heart of how economists actually talk about economic value. And what I tried to do was really to, and I think this is sort of the contribution in terms of the mission finance approach, is to really also position this whole word about value and wealth as a collective endeavor. And what it actually requires is a collective risk-taking, a collective boldness. Which today is more important than ever if we hope to have a planet to live on. And I think Bill Gates, more than so many other business people around the world, has actually recently at least really voiced this, which is we need actually government to lead. Government led with the IT revolution and we followed, meaning Bill Gates talking here, Bill and Steve followed major government investments which got us all the things that make your iPhone smart and not stupid. We need that same leadership for the green revolution. I think where I differ just in terms of this quote is he focuses mainly on sort of the upstream R&D process. And what I want to outline is you actually need that high-level leadership across the entire innovation chain. The basic research, the applied research, the early stage, patient, long-term finance that goes to those firms, small, medium, and large, that are willing to innovate in order to tackle these big, important challenges that'll help us fight climate change, and even more downstream in terms of the demand side, procurement kind of policies, or things like, mass production, by the way, would not have produce the kind of big shift that I mentioned before in terms of production and distribution without a policy change on the demand side that was basically suburbanization. And people like Carlota Perez and myself have been arguing that in some ways on this demand side problem, we should really also see green as a huge demand side shift that allows the ICT revolution even to get that full deployment in diffusion across the whole economy that it still hasn't had. So instead of putting up the internet here and the toilet there, as some economists have done and said, which one would you, get rid of quicker, no emails, or you have to go outside to take a wee in the middle of the night, to kind of joke that actually IT hasn't had this big shift like electricity. The real problem is perhaps that we haven't had that bold demand side policy in the IT age, and wouldn't it be interesting if green actually provided that? Anyway, so these acronyms up here for me are very important because these highlight different types of public institutions which weren't just throwing public money at a problem, but themselves were organized as risk-taking institutions, as mission-oriented institutions that were willing to actually tackle problems as bold as going to the moon and back again in a generation, and had to actually structure their internal organizations and their portfolios in such a way that allowed that. And so I just have the sort of obvious ones here, DARPA, but also in more recent times, ARPA-E in the US, which is a sister organization of DARPA. ARPA-E, the second director was Cheryl Martin. When I spoke to her about these issues, she said, we would never have done the things that we do if we just thought ourselves as fixing things. We actually have to take risks, and we measure our success by how much risk we were willing to take and how much impact our successes have. But if we don't take risks, we're not doing our job inside ARPA-E. And again, that early stage, high risk, patient finance downstream here for the Death Valley phase that might last even 15 years. Most of the venture capital sector is obsessed about exiting in 3 or 5 years. And the VC industry did not get us the biotech, nanotech, or internet revolution. They massively surfed a wave that was actually provided by different types of mission-oriented public institutions. And that's all fine, by the way. This isn't about, accusing them of free riding, but the question is also, do we have that narrative and framework that also allows us to understand those lessons for the future, or do we end up just mythologizing things like the entrepreneur or the venture capital sector without really understanding the entrepreneurial ecosystem that was required for the VC sector to do what it did in these previous big waves? And again, in the entrepreneurial state, I kind of broke apart the smartphones that we all have and said, well, look at what actually makes these smart. From the internet, GPS, touchscreen, and Siri, it was actually this bold investor first resort role that these different institutions had. And in fact, if you look at the Bloomberg New Energy Finance database, which is a dream for anyone interested in actually doing data-driven work in the innovation landscape, it's quite interesting. First of all, there's all sorts of different finance in this space, much more than we had in ICT. There's all sorts of different types of, for example, public banks that we didn't have in the IT sector. But if you break these down into different areas, it's very interesting that we actually see quite similar patterns. But again, less boldness, and currently not enough. In terms of that upper right-hand quadrant, so high capital intensity, high market and technological risk, we have tended to see different types of public institutions sort of leading the way in terms of being there, but again, not enough, and I would argue almost increased, or recently, especially after the financial crisis, with all this talk about reducing public debts and obsessing over deficits as opposed to long-run growth drivers, which of course increase GDP and keep the debt to GDP ratio in check. But not, obsessing about the deficit, which, by the way, Italy has had a low deficit for a long time, but a high debt to GDP, precisely because they haven't had those ambitious public and private investments in the last 20 years. That upper right-hand quadrant is an interesting one to start dissecting. And I already mentioned this role of public banks and development finance institutions. This is a bit outdated, sorry. But they, even more so recently, banks like the China Development Bank, the KfW, the EIB, we have someone here today who'll join us in the panel, have absolutely played a leadership role, but we don't really know how to talk about them. At best, we know how to talk about public banks in terms of counter-cyclical investment. So when private banks retreat, we expect public banks to come in. But what happens when they start to do something like what the KfW did in Germany, which is actually directing that public finance towards achieving important goals like the Energiewende? We start worrying and we talk about things like crowding out or picking winners, when actually we wouldn't have, again, had that IT revolution unless we had also made some bold picking choices, but not picking in terms of putting all your eggs in one basket, whether it's offshore wind or a particular type of computer, but really being bold enough to, again, achieve a target with all sorts of different high-risk investments within that, accepting that some may fail. With the Tesla investment, for example, the Department of Energy in the US, they gave Tesla $500 million guaranteed loan. Same amount of money went to Solyndra. Solyndra went bust, Tesla success. But they didn't actually talk about it that way. They didn't talk about it like an investor first resort portfolio role. So in fact, the US public itself doesn't appreciate or understand the way that their own government has in fact led the way with some of the great successes which then are narrated and told in these problematic narrow ways. But what's interesting about the KfW funding, so the public bank in Germany, is in fact it ended up lending, or still lends, to any type of organization. They don't obsess about SMEs like in some countries where that itself seems to be sort of a metric of value. They've lent high-risk patient finance to any organization which was willing to actually achieve these Energiewende targets. So the steel sector in Germany lowered its material content through the help of these patient finance loans. And this is where I just want to spend my last 3.5 minutes reflecting on. So what I tried to do for the European Commission recently was to say, we got to learn from this stuff. Let's really get real. If we're going to use the words challenge-led innovation and then be bold enough to turn these challenges into missions, like Sandrine was talking about with the great inspirational speech by Kennedy, going to the moon and back again. It's going to cost a lot of money. We're probably going to fail along the way, but the ultimate goal is an important one. Let's learn what happened. So let's just pause a minute with the moonshot. The challenge, of course, at the time was space race and Sputnik. Going to the moon and back again was a concrete target. You could actually say yes or no. Did you achieve it? Whereas with some of the SDGs, they need to be the inspiration, but they're not concrete enough. Did we achieve it or not? Climate change is too broad. Going to the moon and back again required over 12 sectors to innovate, to invest, to take risks, including clothing. You could not get there in jeans and a t-shirt. I'm sure you know that. You couldn't eat anything up there, so nutrition had to innovate. So a concrete mission, which then required innovation, obviously in aeronautics, but actually across many different sectors, and then using the full capacity of government instruments to really crowd in the bottom-up experimentation and exploration at this kind of project level. Over 300 projects, of which many failed. Those that succeeded are, again, those inside your smart products, at least many of them. So they didn't obsess about the technology. The technology was a spillover from actually trying to achieve a concrete target, but again, using whether it's procurement policy, prizes, grants, et cetera, to get there. And so for this European report, which I wrote, which I must say I'm quite happy has actually become part of the legal framework for the Horizon program, turning challenges to missions. There's sort of a mission discussion now, which has turned into a category. The idea is to do the same. So, and these are much harder. So climate change, clean oceans, hunger, the SDGs that we have out there that we have signed up to, what would it look like for each of them to turn them into concrete targets? So climate change, 100 carbon neutral cities by 2030, looking at all the different sectors that would have to innovate and invest in using public funds, not just as handouts to sectors, whether it's through innovation policy or industrial policy, but providing that high-risk patient finance to those organizations across many different sectors willing to tackle that mission, and again, using that full power of the instruments to really drive the bottom-up experimentation. We know this stuff does not work top-down. Clean oceans, again, the plastic-free ocean would require all sorts of investments. I won't bother to read through these. The criteria, they must be bold and address societal value. But who decides what's valuable? It's interesting, the Kennedy moonshot was pretty top-down. It was Kennedy and his guys, basically, who decided that. The end of the agenda, which I just mentioned, is in some ways more interesting because Merkel actually captured the moment. 4 years, 4 decades of a green movement, which really brought legitimacy to that mission, which then she was able to capture and really kind of harness and turn into a top-down mission, but it actually came from a bottom-up movement, and then again used the full power of government instruments to get there. So multiple competing solutions, cross-sectoral, cross-actor, cross-disciplinary. We've currently now been doing this in the UK government in terms of helping them make sure that the industrial strategy doesn't go back to a 1970s kind of approach, which just becomes a handout to different sectors, or even just to blah, blah, blah around the challenges. What would it look like to transform the clean growth, the future mobility challenges in such ways that really drive investment innovation across different sectors? And so the decarbonization missions, what does that look like in a concrete way in terms of creating an innovation structure and road mapping for whether it's mobility, construction, cement, steel, et cetera. This is just a poster, one of the many posters that we've done around the different missions, such as the 21st Century Mobility Challenge-related one. And again, in Scotland, where we helped Nicola Sturgeon set up a public bank because there's just not enough patient finance in this area. Again, careful, don't set up a public bank that then does what the Italian public bank has done over many decades, which is just kind of lend out money to sectors which actually aren't really doing their job. They're just very good at asking for money and different subsidies and guarantees, which kind of creates a problematic public-private partnership, not an ambitious, symbiotic, mutualistic one. So a mission-oriented Scottish National Investment Bank with Laurie McFarlane, who's in the room. We're helping to write the implementation plan for that. Last slide. The reason I said that this is really about creating discomfort is this really requires not only changing how we talk about things, so not de-risking but welcoming uncertainty, not fixing markets but co-creating, co-shaping them, but it also means difficult questions like, well, hold on, if we're going to share the risks, how do we share the rewards? Is it right that the taxpayer just comes in to cover the downside losses? What would it look like if we actually create strong conditions attached also for the upside, which are not just the obvious things like sometimes why not take out some equity, but also what might be the conditions on, for example, reinvestment of profits back into the economy. Energy and pharmaceuticals are the most financialized sectors. Over 100% of net income of some top companies in those two areas are spending more money, so more than 100% of net income, on the combination of share buybacks and dividend payouts. That itself, the corporate governance problem, is itself part of the innovation challenge, and that requires a new type of partnership. Thank you very much.